When studying constitutional rights and safeguards, one needs to bear in mind the following. 1. Is the right absolute or relative? There are 15 absolute constitutional rights and 15 relative constitutional rights. 2. If the right is not absolute, what are the limitations or exceptions to that right recognized by law or in practice or both? 3. Irrespective of whether the right is absolute or relative, can the constitutional fundamental rights overrides be applied to limit the application of that right? The absolute constitutional rights are as follows. 1. Section 35, subsection 3. Right to notification in writing within 24 hours in a language he understands why he has been arrested or detained. 2. Section 35, subsection 4. Right to arraignment within a reasonable time. 3. Section 36, subsection 6a. Right to be informed of the crime alleged. 4. Section 36, subsection 6b. Right to adequate time and facilities for defense. 5. Section 36, subsection 6c. Right to personal legal representation or legal representation by counsel. 6. Section 36, subsection 6d. Right to examine witnesses called by the prosecution. 7. Section 36, subsection 7. Right to obtain records of the proceedings. 8. Section 36, subsection 8. Right against trial upon retroactive legislation. 9. Section 36, subsection 8. Right to penalty not exceeding upper limits of the law. 10. Section 36, subsection 9. Right to one trial for one offense. 11. Section 36, subsection 10. Right against trial for an offense for which the accused has been pardoned. 12. Section 36, subsection 11. Right not to self-incriminate. 13. Section 36, subsection 12. Right to be tried only for an offense known to law. 14. Section 37. Right to private and family life, aka right to privacy. 15. Section 46. Right to seek redress if rights have been contravened, are being contravened, are likely to be contravened. The relative constitutional rights are as follows. 1. Section 33. Right to life. 2. Section 34, subsection 1. Right to dignity of the human person. 3. Section 35, subsection 1. Right to personal liberty. 4. Section 35, subsection 2. Right to silence until conference with a lawyer or other person he chooses. 5. Section 35, subsection 6. Right to public apology and compensation for unlawful arrests and or detention. 6. Section 36, subsection 1. Right to fair hearing. 7. Sections 36, subsection 3 and 36, subsection 4. Right to a fair public trial within a reasonable time by a court or tribunal. 8. Section 36, subsection 5. Right to presumption of innocence. 9. Section 36, subsection 6e. Right to an interpreter at no cost to him. 10. Section 38. Right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. 11. Section 39. Right to freedom of expression and the press. 12. Section 40. Right to peaceful assembly and association. 13. Section 41. Right to freedom of movement. 14. Section 42. Right to freedom from discrimination. 15. Section 43 and 44. Right to acquire immovable property and right to freedom from indiscriminate takeover of movable and immovable property except by lawful means. This video will then conclude with a consideration of the constitutional fundamental right over rights in section 45 of the 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria as amended. Section 33 subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to life. It also admits one exception or limitation: the execution of the sentence of a court in respect of a criminal offense of which he has been found guilty in Nigeria. Section 33 subsection 2 contains 4 additional exceptions or limitations. Death from the use of reasonable force by law enforcement in the following 3 circumstances. 1. Property defense and or defense of people or persons. 2. Lawful arrests and or attempted escape from lawful custody. 3. Law enforcement's response to a riot, insurrection, or mutiny. Section 34 subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to the dignity of the person. Section 34 subsection 2 contains 7 exceptions or limitations to forced or compulsory labor. 1. Sentence or court order. 2. Labor as a result or consequence of belonging to law enforcement. 3. Alternatives to military service by conscientious objectors. 4. Reasonable labor imposed by government as a consequence of an emergency. 5. Normal communal or civic obligations. 6. Compulsory national service as a consequence of being a member of law enforcement, provided that such labor is backed by legislation. 7. Compulsory non-military national service, provided that such labor is backed by legislation. Section 35 subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to personal liberty. Section 35 subsection 1a to f contains exceptions or limitations to personal liberty. 1. Restrictions to personal liberty to ensure execution of a court order or sentence. 2. Restrictions to personal liberty due to failure to obey a court order or sentence. 3. Restrictions to personal liberty to enforce his fulfillment of obligations imposed on him by law. 4. Restrictions to personal liberty to enforce his attendance at a court over a matter that involves him. 5. Restrictions to personal liberty such as detention as a precautionary measure to prevent crime. 6. Restriction to personal liberty involving the detention of juveniles to secure their education. 7. Restrictions to personal liberty involving detention to protect the society from transmissible diseases. 8. Restrictions to personal liberty involving detention to protect the society from the mentally unstable. 9. Restrictions to personal liberty involving detention to protect the society from drug addicts. 10. Restrictions to personal liberty involving detention to guarantee care of or treatment of anyone suffering from any or all of the above. And 12, restrictions to personal liberty involving detention to effect the expulsion or removal of the individual so long as the period of lawful custody awaiting trial does not exceed the maximum term of imprisonment for the crime in the books. Section 35, subsection 2 is the constitutional basis for the right to silence until conference with a lawyer or other person he chooses. There are no limitations or exceptions for this right. Section 35, subsection 3 is the constitutional basis for the right to notification in writing within 24 hours in a language he understands why he has been arrested or detained. Section 35, subsection 4 is the constitutional basis for the right to arraignment within a reasonable time. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 35, subsection 6 is the constitutional basis for the right to public apology and compensation for unlawful arrest and or detention. There are three exceptions or limitations to this right. 1. A person arrested or detained upon reasonable suspicion of having committed a capital offense. 2. The detention of a member of the armed forces authorized or sanctioned by legislation for a period not exceeding 3 months. And 3. The detention of a member of the Nigerian police force authorized or sanctioned by legislation for a period not exceeding 3 months. If found guilty of committing an offense. Section 36, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to fair hearing. Section 36, subsection 2 contains the following exceptions or limitations to fair hearing. 1. Government agencies or authorities other than the courts may address issues of law that affect or have a tendency to affect the civil rights and obligations of anyone so long as the person or persons affected can state their side of the story in advance of a decision being made. 2. Government agencies or authorities other than the courts may address issues of law that affect or have a tendency to affect the civil rights and obligations of anyone so long as their decision is not final and conclusive. Section 36, subsection 3 is a constitutional basis for the right to a public trial, while Section 36, subsection 4 is the constitutional basis for a fair hearing in public. The combined effect of both provisions is that fair hearing and a public trial are both constitutional rights. Though this right is often called the right to a public trial, the more appropriate description of the right is right to a fair public trial within a reasonable time by a court or tribunal. Section 36, subsection 4a contains the following exceptions or limitations. There are 7 instances or scenarios in which the court or tribunal may exercise its discretion to determine that the greater interests of justice outweigh the need for a public trial, and those are 1. Defense, 2. Public safety, 3. Public order, 4. Public morality, 5. The welfare of persons who have not attained the age of 18 years, 6. The protection of the private lives of the parties, and 7. Any other special circumstances. Section 36, subsection 4b contains limitations on who can notify and satisfy the court that the exemptions or limitations in Section 36, subsection 4a should apply. These include at the federal level, an honorable minister; at the state level, an honorable commissioner. Section 36, subsection 5 is the constitutional basis for the right to presumption of innocence. Section 36, subsection 5 contains just one exception or limitation. It is the duty of the accused to prove particular facts such as insanity, facts peculiarly within his knowledge, and intoxication. The fact that the burden of proof falls upon the accused does not take away that presumption. That is to say, the courts pronounce an accused guilty or convict an accused, not the police. Section 36, subsection 6a is the constitutional basis for the right to be informed of the crime alleged. In other words, this is a right to know in detail 1. The offense he is charged with, and 2. In a language he understands. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 6b is a constitutional basis for the right to adequate time and facilities for defense. There are no limitations or exceptions to those rights. Section 36, subsection 6c is a constitutional basis for the right to legal representation by self or legal representation by counsel. There are no limitations or exceptions to those rights. Section 36, subsection 6d is a constitutional basis for the right to examine witnesses called by the prosecution. There are no limitations or exceptions allowed in law, but there is at least one allowed in practice, and that is that a judge cannot be called to testify in a case he served as either an officer or a judicial officer. Section 36, subsection 6E is the constitutional basis for the right to an interpreter. Section 36, subsection 6E contains one limitation or exception. If the trial is held in a language that he understands, then he doesn't need an interpreter. Section 36, subsection 7 is the constitutional basis for the right to obtain records of the proceedings. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 8 is the constitutional basis for the right against trial upon retroactive legislation. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 8 is the constitutional basis for the right to penalty not exceeding the upper limits of the law. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 9 is the constitutional basis for the right to one trial for one offense. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 10 is the constitutional basis for the right against trial for an offense for which the accused has been pardoned, or in other words, right not to be tried for an offense for which he has already been pardoned. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 11 is the constitutional basis for the right not to self-incriminate. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 36, subsection 12 is the constitutional basis for the right to be tried only for an offense known to law. In other words, is the right not to be tried for an unwritten offense and the right not to be charged for crimes for which there is no prescribed penalty in law. There are no limitations or exceptions to this right. Section 37 is the constitutional basis for the right to privacy. There are no limitations or exceptions allowed in law, except those contained in the constitutional fundamental rights overrides in Section 45. Section 38, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Section 38, subsection 2 contains one application of that right. Section 38, subsection 3 contains one limitation or exception, and that is that schools owned by a religious community or denomination can provide religious instruction for pupils of that community or denomination. Section 38, subsection 4 contains the second limitation or exception, and that is that the activities or membership of a secret cult or society is not an exercise of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Section 39, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to freedom of expression and the press. Section 39, subsection 2 contains one limitation or exception to the effect that ownership, establishment, or operation of a television station or wireless broadcasting station shall be dependent on licensing by the President upon fulfillment of conditions contained in legislation enacted by the National Assembly. Section 39, subsection 3 contains a few more limitations or exceptions, including that laws preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence is an appropriate exception. 2. Laws maintaining the authority and independence of the courts is yet another exception. Laws regulating telephony, wireless broadcasting, television, or the exhibition of cinematographic films is yet another exception. And laws at the federal, state, security service or agency imposing restrictions on persons holding office or members is yet another restriction. Section 40 is a constitutional basis for the right to freedom of assembly and association. Section 40 contains one limitation involving the distinction between registered and recognized political parties on the one hand and unregistered and unrecognized political parties on the other hand by the Independent National Electoral Commission. Section 41, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to freedom of movement. Section 41, subsection 2a contains one limitation with respect to the restriction on the movement of a person who has committed or is reasonably suspected of having committed a criminal offense. Section 41 subsection 2b1 contains one limitation with respect to ensuring the removal of any person from Nigeria to any other country to be tried in that country for any criminal offense contingent on the condition of reciprocity by the authorities of that country. Section 41 subsection 2b2 contains one limitation with respect to ensuring the removal of any person from Nigeria to any other country to be imprisoned in that country in execution of the sentence of a court of law that found him guilty of commission of a crime contingent on the condition of reciprocity by the authorities of that country towards Nigeria. Section 42, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of his community, ethnic group, place of origin, sex, religion, or political opinion. Section 42, subsection 2 is a constitutional basis for the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of the circumstances of his birth. Section 42, subsection 3 contains four limitations: restrictions on the appointment of any person to any office under a state, restrictions on the membership of the armed forces of the Federation, restrictions on the membership of the Nigerian Police Force, restrictions on the membership or service of a body corporate established directly by any law in force in Nigeria. Slide 43 is the constitutional basis for the right to acquire immovable property. Section 44, subsection 1 is the constitutional basis for the right to freedom from the indiscriminate takeover of movable and immovable property except by lawful means. Section 44, subsection 1a contains the following limitations or exceptions. 1. Where the law prescribes and requires the prompt payment of compensation for the compulsory takeover of movable or immovable property. Where the law prescribes and requires that a person claiming compensation be given a right of access for the determination of his interest in the property and the amount of compensation to a court of law or tribunal or body with competent jurisdiction. Section 44, subsection 2 contains the following limitations or exceptions. 3. The general law's prescription of the imposition or enforcement of any tax, rates, or duty. 4. The general law's prescription of the imposition of penalties or forfeiture for breach of any law, whether under civil process or after conviction for an offense. 5. The general law's prescription of a procedure for discharging obligations relating to leases, tenancies, mortgages, charges, bills of sale, or any other rights or obligations arising out of contracts. 6. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to the vesting and administration of the property of persons adjudged or otherwise declared bankrupt or insolvent, persons of unsound mind or deceased persons, corporate and incorporate bodies in the course of being wound up. 7. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to the execution of judgment or orders of courts. 8. The general law's prescription of a procedure for the taking over of possession of the property that is in a dangerous state, injurious to the health of human beings, plants, or animals. 9. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to the takeover of enemy property. 10. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to trusts and trustees. 11. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to limitation of action. 12. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to property vested in bodies corporate directly established by any law in force in Nigeria. 13. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to the temporary taking over of possession of property for the purpose of any examination, investigation, or inquiry. 14. The general law's prescription of a procedure relating to the carrying out of work on land for the purpose of soil conservation. 15. The general law permits any authority or person to enter, survey, or dig any land, or to lay, install, or erect poles, cables, wires, pipes, or other conductors or structures on any land in order to provide or maintain the supply or distribution of energy, fuel, water, sewage, telecommunication services, or other public facilities or public utilities, provided that there is prompt payment of compensation for damage to buildings, economic trees, or crops. 16. All minerals, mineral oils, natural gas, in, under, or upon any land in Nigeria, or in, under, or upon the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone of Nigeria, are the property of the Nigerian government. Section 46 is the constitutional basis for the right to seek redress if rights have been contravened, are being contravened, are likely to be contravened. There is no limitation or exception to this right. The five fundamental rights over rights are defense, 1, 2, public safety, 3, public order, 4, public morality, 5, public health, 6, protection of the rights and freedoms of other persons. In the words of section 45, subsection 1, nothing in sections 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41 of this Constitution shall invalidate any law that is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health, or for the purpose of protecting the rights and freedoms of other persons. In the words of section 45, subsection 2, an act of the National Assembly shall not be invalidated by reason only that it provides for the taking, during periods of emergency, of measures that derogate from the provisions of section 33 or 35 of this Constitution, but no such measures shall be taken in pursuance of any such act during any period of emergency, save to the extent that those measures are reasonably justifiable for the purpose of dealing with the situation that exists during that period of emergency, provided that nothing in this section shall authorize any derogation from the provisions of section 33 of this Constitution, except in respect of death resulting from acts of war, or authorize any derogation from the provisions of section 36, subsection 8 of this Constitution. This brings us to the end of constitutional rights and safeguards for an accused person. In the next part, you'll be considering procedural criminal rights and safeguards for an accused person. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, then support this channel by liking this video, subscribing to this channel, sharing this video with anyone that would find it beneficial, and hit the notification bell so you can get notified when new videos are published.